if we've got a data set that's built on flawed over-policing of communities of color in the 1980s during the gang panics of that time, the 80s and 90s, which we know is the case, and those are the data that are going to undergird the predictive policing system, what do we think the outcome is going to be about where crime is likely to occur in LA?
How might and or does AI perpetuate social inequities in ways that we may not realize as users?
Do you want to jump in?
Sure, I'm all for that. So I think one of the issues on the table for all of us who are interested in issues of justice and equity is the way in which many of us are at a moment in our social and civic lives where I think we could easily make the claim that some state of social justice for all people has not been achieved. And at the same time, we have these systems that, in large part, are technological systems that have placed themselves in terms of business model in the social. They work in ways that we often can't understand or see, and they work at an accelerated pace at an unprecedented scale. And so we have a kind of a mismatch here where we have these systems being applied to our social lives at a time of great inequity that lead to outcomes that are at best unclear, that may not benefit all people equally, and that are often built by people who frankly aren't expert in the area of the social. And so I think all of those issues combine to put us in a situation where we really have to question some of the tools that have become so ubiquitous in our daily life in terms of their impact.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in on not being expert on the social, because that is an understatement, right? Because the people who make these technologies are often computer scientists, right? Or, related data scientists or people, experts, who don't really see themselves as having anything to do with the social. And that is institutionalized also in the ways in which they learn how to go about their jobs, right? So the problem is then, when they don't understand anything about, say, racism, sexism, intersectionality, right? All the stuff that we need to have a good understanding of in order to not repeat the mistakes of the past, and in order to have a, fighting chance at, making technology to work to improve our lives rather than to perpetuate and exacerbate existing inequalities, right? We need to be able to make people who make these technologies, which saturate all of our lives, right? They saturate all of our environments and our everyday engagements with each other. So we have to enable people who make these technologies to have a better understanding of the social, and we're not at a point there. And the problem is that at the end of this process of making technology, right, it appears like magic, right? It's just technology, right? It's just science, it's just technology, it's just math, and it's not. But it appears like that, it appears neutral, and it appears sort of with that authority, right? Those 300 years of techno-scientific authority, which led us to believe that, anything that has to do with technology, we really don't have any say in it. And I think it's a fundamentally democratic problem, right? That we really have to figure out how to enable more democratic participation in these processes of making these technologies which saturate our lives.
Wow. I mean, Norma, in your work, you you do a few case studies where you talk to computer scientists and engineers, and I was wondering if you could provide like an example of what you're talking about in your work. I was really struck, for instance, by the example of Robin, the PhD student, doing surveillance work, so maybe you can go into that a bit.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to provide a couple of examples. So what I did is I'm completing a book on ethnography that I did with a bunch of computer scientists, and it's really weird for me to actually write this book because I come from a computer science family. So I'm the black sheep who studied sociology instead of computer science, and I end up studying computer science, which is super lame. But so I ended up doing this study with a bunch of computer scientists who were developing a smart video surveillance system, and so they. The software that they're making, or the algorithms, how we talk about it now, right? The algorithms that they were making were supposed to detect dangerous behavior, right? So automatically. So they did a behavior analysis algorithm, which is stuff that we see now everywhere, right? So from the Compass algorithm to social media algorithms everywhere, right? So these are all behavior analysis algorithms. So I wanted to understand something about race and gender and class, and whether or not they would inscribe these kinds of categories into the algorithms, because for me, coming from this family of computer science, it was blatantly clear that, hey, this is a recipe for disaster. This can only go wrong, and it did, really. So I went around and I asked them I tried to figure out how were they thinking about the social, because when engineers and computer scientists make technology, they have to make up theories of the social. We don't necessarily think about it as formal theories, but they have some idea about who the people are who are going to use the technology and what they're going to do with the technologies and how they're going to engage with each other. So they have some rudimentary, they make what we sometimes call folk theories, right? So they make folk theories of the social, and then they embed that in the technology, and then it becomes real because the technology then is used, right? And that's when these, what we sometimes call biases. I'm actually arguing against using the term bias because I think it's misleading, but where that becomes real. So I have several examples. I give you one example. Of one of the computer scientists who I asked them. So I asked one of the computer scientists, Marco, actually. So Marco was I was asking him, hey, so what's happening? Are you using gender and age and race recognition? And he's like, no, we're actually not allowed to do that, but I'm doing that in a different project. Do you want to see it? It's like, yeah, show me your algorithm. And he's super excited, and yeah, I have this age and gender recognition. I'll show you, and pulls out his laptop and connects it to the camera in the room, and then pulls up the screen, and then we see our faces. We're standing next to each other, right? And he's a white man in his early 30s. So we're seeing our faces on the screen, and letters and numbers pop up next to our faces right on the screen, supposedly indicating our gender and age. And so whereas the algorithm guessed his gender and age correctly, man in his early 30s, something like that, the algorithm told us that I was a man in my mid-40s. And I was in my mid-20s at the time. So,
and were you a man?
And I did not identify as a man, and I was not assigned a male at birth. So what happened here was, I was doing I was doing the study in Germany. And Germany is very, very white, right? And I'm a person of color, at least I was until I moved to Canada. Now I'm white passing. So anyway, what happened was that this was a machine learning algorithm which learned the features of what a man looks like and what a woman looks like from a training data set, right? And what happened was that Marco trained the algorithm with women who didn't look like me. He trained the algorithm on data with white women, right? And here's the thing, and this is which is so hard to understand. It's not that racist engineer who sits at Google and does this, but it's this really, really ordinary racist assumption that what is normal is white. This assumption of whiteness, right? Which is the default mode in which to engage with the world. and the lack of diversity is not helping at all. So my question, or the question that I'm trying to push with the book is, what would it take for this kind of stuff not to happen? And I'm landing on the answer, which is really, really unpopular. I'm making myself very unpopular with it. I'm anticipating a lot of pushback with that, because there is, if computer scientists are having so much, what they're doing has so much consequences, there's no other way than teaching computer scientists sociology or STS or any social science, which enables them to systematically actually know what they're doing and what the consequences are of what they're doing.
I'm just going to give a quick anecdote myself, which is, so I live and work in Los Angeles. I'm a new arrival. I used to live in Canada, actually, so shout outs to any of my former students who may be in the audience. But I'm living in LA now, and Los Angeles is well known as a highly policed city, and communities of color are, of course, particularly targeted and impacted by this policing. You can imagine that there is an impetus, and there is an economic impetus, to be specific, around building systems of predictive policing that can be marketed and sold to organizations like LAPD. There is one in particular that does work with LAPD. Fortunately or unfortunately, it is a colleague of mine on the campus of UCLA who's behind this company. And one of the critiques of this particular product that he's developed, which he considers to be a predictive policing tool, is that it's built on data collected by the LAPD, a notoriously racist, problematic policing organization. I was talking with my colleague Safia Noble, a colleague and friend, and we were, joking, as we do sometimes about these things, try to just deal with it. And she said, look, who are these tools for? Like, this is the question we must ask, right? Who are the tools for? For whom are these algorithms being built? And based on what Norma said. Because here's the deal. Communities of color in LA don't need predictive policing. You know why? Because they know where the hell the cops are going to show up, and it's in their neighborhoods, okay? So this is the kind of, it's like sort of, we were joking about it when we said this, but that's the truth. Obviously, these tools aren't being created to aid communities of color that are already over-policed. And we know computer scientists and engineers in the crowd know the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. If we've got a data set that's built on flawed over-policing of communities of color in the 1980s during the gang panics of that time, the 80s and 90s, which we know is the case, and those are the data that are going to undergird the predictive policing system. What do we think the outcome is going to be about where crime is likely to occur in LA? So that's just one example of the ways in which there is a gross mismatch between the social side of what some people might be endeavoring to do, and the way these tools will obfuscate those ends. Never mind the economic impetus here. I think when the subject of our panel is social justice, and I don't think it's a given that everyone is equally invested in those goals anyway. So I'd just even throw that out there too. Like, on what grounds do we think that social media companies have any kind of reason to want to foreground those kinds of norms over others?
Okay, I'm just going to switch gears a little bit in this conversation, because we've been talking about people who create these technologies and the companies that create these technologies and some of the ideologies, I guess, that go into these technologies. But then, Sarah, your work really goes into the people who are responsible for maintaining the technology once it's out there in the world and doing good or wreaking havoc. So
right.
I was wondering if maybe you can go into some of your work
Sure.
on context moderation, and then some of the issues that have arisen as a result of that work.
Sure, thank you. Right. So the primary focus of my academic work is actually to look at the humans that are at various points in the production chain of social media in particular. What I came to find out was that, in fact, there are humans all along. Wherever we care to look, we will find human input. And these systems cannot, in fact, function without that input, whether it's sort of at the abstract level of mining knowledge and decision making that then gets put into computational systems, which certainly is the case, or whether it's literally humans pretending to be computational systems, which also is often the case, and that's been grabbing headlines lately. Alexa listening in to conversations to transcribe them. Turns out those are humans doing that, not just magical computational engines. So my work focuses on what I call commercial content moderators, and these are people who, in the case of the study that I've done that's in the book, frontline people working in live environments on social media platforms, screening content for appropriateness. And they're screening, when we think about what constitutes appropriateness, they're screening based on a set of norms, rules, internal policies that have been developed by the social media companies themselves. These workers are often removed from those companies, so they're often contract laborers, maybe 1 or 2 steps away from the actual solicitor of that work, but nonetheless, they're moderating towards those norms. They may also be responsible for legal norms in a particular jurisdiction or other kinds of norms, cultural norms, for example. But primarily and fundamentally, what they are engaged in doing is a brand protection scheme for the companies, on behalf of the companies. I started this work in 2010. At that time, I'd been online for over 20 years myself. I'd had a career in IT, and I was doing a PhD in information science, and yet it had never occurred to me that the scope and scale of social media, again, almost 10 years ago, would render this kind of low-level engagement, and when I say low level, I mean the status assigned to these workers by the companies. The work they do is actually quite sophisticated. But in fact, there are probably, I would say conservatively, 100,000 people doing this work right now around the globe. The issues that come up that I think you're gesturing at are these very issues of where are these people in the world? Who are they culturally, ethnically, sociologically, demographically? Who are they in terms of class? How are they classified within the work that they do in the companies that they do? Well, I can tell you low status and low wage, precarious work, cycled in, cycled out. And what they often have to do is take their own sensibilities and set those aside and sort of take on another sensibility. For workers in the Philippines, for example, that means adopting ideologies that were born and created and then packaged up and exported from Silicon Valley. Not just from the United States, which is its own thing, right? Sitting here in Canada, I don't need to tell folks that. Anyway, but particularly from Silicon Valley, which is its own specific ideology of technological supremacy and a belief in computational decision-making as better always than other kinds of decision-making. And yet here we have these humans kind of pretending to be algorithms, flowchart logic. If this is present, then do that. If this much boob shows, remove image. I'm not even kidding. It gets so granular as to be absurd. So there are conflicts that arise, right? And the humans are often, who are on the front lines, are the ones who are the most sensitized to that kind of conflict, right? I have one person in my research who talks about his problem with constantly seeing videos of blackface and raising the issue in his company, saying, look, we say we don't allow racism. Hello, this is blackface video. That's what this is. I mean, again, sensitive moment in Canada around this issue. Thank you. I do keep up with the news, folks, about what's going on up here. And yet, he would take this forward to the policymakers in his company, and they were not concerned. Maybe because of who they were and how that resonated with them, right? Maybe there's value in circulating racist content, right? Again, going to this thought that, is everyone on board with social justice? I'm not sure that they are. And racial equality? Maybe not.
I actually have a question for Sarah.
Okay.
Because I think that with just what you just said, that I don't know if there is a value in racist content. And it's like, to me, it just, and I'm just curious if you can report about sort of your impressions from your field work about that, because if I think about digital capitalism and in these new ways of monetizing all kinds of stuff, including hateful content seems to be a big money machine.
It sells,
right?
Yeah.
So if I'm just super curious, what you can.
But before you do that, Sarah, no, that's great. Maybe you can explain, Norma, what you mean by digital capitalism.
Oh, okay. So what I mean by that is, so there's various theories at the moment thinking about data as commodity, right? So most of you will have heard data is the new oil and blah, 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 and so forth, right? So in that data, much of that data is collected through social media, but also through stuff like consumer cards, right? Like bonus cards and credit cards and all of that, right? So, and this data is really, really profitable, right? Because you can sell it to, Facebook, for example, uses it to do targeted advertising, right? Much, much more precise advertising, so that, for example, pregnancy clothing is only like sold to targeted at pregnant women, for example, right? So, and scholars are trying to figure out how a way of, is this new, is this old, is this just, like what is this? But the core is, okay, this is economic value generation based on data, right? And the more clicks content gets, the more advertising is shown, right? So if we think about YouTube, for example, right? The more clicks, the more ads, the more money. Hateful content tends to generate a lot of clicks. That means that hateful content tends to generate a lot of money for corporations which sell these data, right? So this is sort of the relationship between digital capitalism or data capitalism, or however you want to call it, and so the circulation of hateful content that we're just rightfully discussing in public. And this is sort of the background from my question.
So I think what I would say is that, I think you brought up a few issues that we probably want to get on the table anyway, which is that what actually is the nature of a social media company? What's it in the business of doing? And as you gestured at, Norma, it is in the business of selling advertising to advertisers. So when we think of ourselves as the customers of social media companies, that's actually somewhat inaccurate. We're actually the commodity of the company. And what the social media firms are endeavoring to do is connect their clients, who are advertisers, to us, the consumers, and also to sell, as Norma said, to aggregate things about us and to do better advertising, or suggest to its clients that it can do better advertising by knowing what we want, or even predicting, in many cases, what we might like. According to my purchasing from Instagram, it's doing a hell of a job, by the way. I don't know, it's like middle-aged woman who likes big scarves and stuff. Yeah, look at. Anyway, so that's sort of like the nature of it. I think there's some abstractions at play there, but I always like to give the case of YouTube as one that's really easy to understand, because in the case of YouTube, there is a direct relationship in terms of monetization between the content that's produced and remuneration for that content. In other words, you create a hit video on YouTube, a viral video, and YouTube will cut you a check. They will straight up cut you a check, send you a check, and pay you. When we think about social media companies sort of telling us, as they have over the last 15 years, what they are and who they are, it goes beyond the existential. They tell us over and over again they're tech firms. That's not just because they have a predisposition to want to be tech firms. There are regulations in place in our countries around firms that are media companies, right? TV can't just broadcast whatever, right? There has to be equal time for candidates, for example, political candidates. There are all sorts of things. Children's advertising came up in the last session. You can't just do anything with regard to children's advertising. But because these companies have continually suggested that they're kind of this sui generis entity, they have been able to.
Do you mind explaining what?
The kind of the never before existed.
Okay.
First time we've ever seen anything like this ever. They have suggested that over and over again. They have managed to kind of fool everyone, and I think we have to think about the reasons for that. So When we think about content and we think about what sells, sure, cute cat video, that can go viral, no problem, especially if I'm on social media. I'm going to forward that to everyone. But what else sells? Well, we know that prurient, controversial things that straddle just this side of bearable often sell too. The content moderators that I talked to and interviewed over the years have talked about needing to straddle that line of understanding that this material is a commodity for the firm, and that there are also relationships that need to be managed. Now, who holds a lot of the power in this relationship are the advertisers. More and more, those advertisers have been saying, you know what, get my stuff off of, I'm trying to think of some virulent racist. None comes to mind, thank God. But anyway, somebody awful, get me off of Alex Jones. I don't want my ads to show up next to him, right? Yeah. Or I don't want my ads to show up next to such and such type of content. So they actually have a lot of power in negotiating those relationships. Yeah. But there is a huge power imbalance in terms of just regular everyday people who get exposed to that material, never mind those who have to be the arbiters of it.
Well, okay, so just a heads up, Alex Jones is like this really right-wing American
right-wing, and
yeah.
I would say conspiracy theorist type person.
Yeah, and he had a popular YouTube channel.
Yeah, I mean, I confess to not knowing intensely what he's all about, but I think I got the gist.
Yeah, but he was recently kicked off a bunch of platforms, essentially.
Right. Yes.
But one of the things, but going back to the conversation, one of the things that really struck me about your work, both you and Norma, is how the extent to which large tech companies go to hiding the fact that there's so much human involvement in their work. That's right. So, in the case of the moderators, the moderators often are in other countries from where the large tech company is based, or if it's done in-house, it's done in the separate kind of side room or whatever, yes. And they wear different badges. It's very That's weird. Right. And then Norma, in your case, you were talking about sort of the culture around computer science, where it's very much considered unnecessary to know about what's going on in the world, that everything is very mathematical, there's this movement to make it very sort of just numbers. Yeah, it's just numbers. So I was wondering if you can talk to why there is that movement, and also what does it allow these tech companies to do that they wouldn't be able to do if we were kind of more aware of the human connection, or the human labor involved.
Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll try to be succinct. I mean, I think the biggest issue here is the desire to kind of escape the responsibility for having to explain decision making. I think it's just that simple. That there's a particular statute in the United States that governs or has traditionally governed these firms, and that allows them to have discretion. The discretion to keep content up, the discretion to remove content. But it fundamentally falls to them. And when the notion is that all of those decisions are made by math, when it's just numbers, when it's just, you input it and this is what the system gives us, I think for a long time, consumers were led to believe, I don't think people are idiots, I think they were led to believe that that was equitable, and that was the best way, and that's how it always worked. And I don't think any of those things are the case, but I think what the companies want to do is reduce the friction on the decisions that they make so that they can do their business as they see fit. And that goes to being responsible to consumers and users, or another word we might employ is citizens. That's one that I like to use sometimes, but also to regulators. Right. So I think that's the logic there.
Yeah, I think we have to regulate the shit out of these companies. Pardon my French. But but I couldn't agree more. And it's the same thing for the people who make these, right? On the one hand, the companies benefit from hiding all that labor because, Google can say, or, Amazon can say, this is our amazing technology, buy it, because it can do everything on its own, right? Yep. When it really can't do it, which is why Lady Rani talks about artificial intelligence, right? Which is, I think, a really, really great term to think about, sort of some of these processes. But the same thing, this displacement of accountability, I totally agree with Sarah, is key here, right? And it's the same thing with the engineers that are making these technologies, right? Because and this is what I found in my field work, and this is what other studies of scientists in general, right? Not only computer science, but all kind, like the technical sciences, the natural sciences. It's not me, it's nature. It's not me, it's just math, right? So, and what it allows people to do is to say, no. Like, I have no accountability for the kinds of consequences. And you know what? The sad thing about this, there are a few studies, but there are some studies, is that this is systematically taught to engineers. So there's one sociologist, her name is Erin Check, and she did a longitudinal study of engineers in the US and of undergrads, and she asked them in the beginning of their study about sort of their political views and whether they think that what they're doing has something to do, if they're trying to change the world, or if they see themselves as having an accountability or responsibility to use their skills for improving society, right? In the beginning, most of them were on board. And then 4 years after, nothing. And that is sad. Like, what are we doing? I mean, seriously, if we have kids going into engineering programs, trying to change the world for the better, right? And then after 4 years, they have a completely different worldview. We're doing something wrong, I would say, right? So I think we really need to think about, really rethink sort of this very modernist idea of science as being outside of society, but really anchor science and science education inside society, including sort of systematic ways of thinking about these issues. But yeah.
Yup. That's it.
So, again, to mic drop, to switch gears again, another piece too that was really interesting in both of your work is just looking at the ways in which a lot of this labor, around content moderation or building sort of algorithms, a lot of it is kind of taught to us as users, and then we kind of confuse that a lot of the times for sort of leisure activities, right? Because a lot of the work we're doing is actually labor for these large tech companies as well when we upload photos or whatever. So I was wondering if you could outline what some of the ways in which users could be more aware of how their activities online kind of contribute to this.
I think the way that I think about social media platforms is that they are, without all of us and without our engagement, empty. They're just empty vessels. That's maybe an overstatement, because nowadays companies like YouTube have production studios, and we have Facebook developing series and things like that. But for the most part, I think it stands. In other words, we are all part of that production chain. I don't fault people for wanting to express themselves in those ways. As a person who's, again, I've been on the internet since 1993. I got on the social internet at that time. I was pretty sure, as a late adopter, that I had missed all the cool stuff, and it was over. And this was like a pre-graphical internet. I think the problem isn't in wanting to share and wanting to connect. I think the problem comes in the model that has been offered to us, which is one of commoditization of that activity. So I think about a term like content as being exemplar of this. Who said all of human activity, all of human behavior, human thought, human expression should make sense to be condensed into something called content? What even is that? But we all sort of bought into it, and we're all kind of cool with that. Yeah, content creators, content. My stuff is content. That kind of, my relationships are content. That should tell us something. In terms of the particular activities of moderation of that material, a lot of us have had the experience of encountering something that we found disturbing online, incorrect, shouldn't be there, problematic, and we've reported it. And that is often the first step in the moderation process, although that's that's changing. But for this kind of frontline reactive moderation that I discuss in the book, that is how it often gets triggered. And so in that sense, too, we are a part of that cycle. But yet, how many of you have ever gotten a check cut from Facebook for your content creation? Right, that's what I thought. Nobody. So I think, again, there's sort of an imbalance, and I think the problem isn't the sociality per se, although I'm all for having richer, better, greater engagement offline with each other like we're doing here today. I mean, this is an incredible example of what that looks like. But the problem is the enclosure. The problem is the enclosure into corporatized, commoditized spaces. It's only been 15 years that that's been the case. And I think our imagination has been limited in that time greatly by what's possible. We need more systems, other options outside of models that want to take our expression and turn it into commodity, and yet there's a paucity of those options. So that's kind of how I think about our own complicity, if you will, in some of this. I cannot advocate here today that we throw away our devices, get off the systems that we're on, because I'm not willing to do it. I can't do it, I'm not willing to do it, and I see value in maintaining some of that. But at the same time, I think we have to encourage some of these people that Norma's talking about, the young engineers, the people coming up, to think differently about these models and maybe reject what's on offer to create something radically different and new. That would be my hope.
Mine as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that?
I was just thinking about, so I'm not sure if I can get this out in a coherent way, but I'm thinking about sort of the way in which we've started to think about citizens as users and what that means. Because as Sarah just said, like these spaces, they seem like they're public space, right? Just, like we bump into each other and have a conversation, just like, citizens engaging with each other. But they're not. They're commoditized spaces, right? And I don't know if that's right, but I have sort of this intuition that we're starting to think about citizens as users, and I'm very scared about what that means and what the consequences are. Right, if we think about them, and I mean, like we work in universities. We've already started about thinking our students as clients, which I think is a massive problem. Yeah. Right now, they're not my clients; they're here to learn, right? And my job is to teach them something, right? So to this commoditization of things that should not be commoditized, like human rights, citizenship, right?
Information seeking.
Education. Yes, exactly. So this is just something that I've been starting to think about, and which is kind of scary to me.
Okay, so I think maybe we have time for like one more question. So I'm going to ask it, and then we'll open it up to the floor for audience questions. But Sarah, in reading your book, I came across this like really, I think, lovely quote from this scholar that you quote. Their name is Shannon Mattern, and they say, online and off, we need to create and defend virtual spaces of information exchange, and we need to strengthen the local governments and institutions that shape the public use of those spaces. The future of American, I'm going to insert Canadian here as well, democracy depends on it. So my question here then is, what role can and should public institutions like libraries, which is an institution you kind of reference in your book, play in safeguarding those spaces, and what role can citizens play in safeguarding those spaces as well? Yeah,
thanks for asking that. I really appreciate it. So Shannon Mattern is a scholar at the New School in New York, and while not in library and information studies herself, she's done a lot of work in that area, and I really respect her succinct call, and that's why I quoted her there. In the other part of my life, outside of my research, I work with and have the honor to train people who are going into librarianship and the information professions. That's what I did here in Canada. That's what I do at UCLA. And many of those people, whether they're kind of young people or they're people coming back for second or third careers, we have a gamut of folks interested, they have a pressing sense of needing to maintain and expand those kinds of public institutions of information seeking because of the perception that I think is accurate of encroachment upon those spaces, right? Yeah. And I think that's what Shannon Mattern is getting at as well. It's not as if we don't have models for other ways. As Norma was saying, these social media platforms, they offer us ease and they offer us, they're seductive, and their functionality is unparalleled in many ways to connect us, but they're not the only way. And that functionality comes at a cost, and the cost is obfuscating the fact that we're not in the public square, we're in the shopping mall. And at the shopping mall, when you start acting out or doing something they don't like, the security guard comes and taps you and says, get out of here. Yeah. You don't have a right to be here. At any time, they can trespass you from those spaces. We have other models. We have public institutions. Now, particularly in the United States, although to a certain extent in Canada as well, but over the past 40 years, public schools and public institutions like public libraries have been decimated budgetarily, decimated sort of in terms of their stature, right, in terms of the public. And we can reverse the course on that. We can shore those things up. We can demand that politicians, for example, in an election cycle, speak to how they are going to address supporting institutions like that, which can, not only can they be a bit of a bulwark against some of this encroachment, but they can also offer expertise to citizens, your point, who want to use those tools, but who need to have some guidance about, hey, just because this pops up first in the Google search, it might not be the best information, right?
Yeah.